Let me start by asking you something. How far would you go to protect the people you love? And what if you later realized that you weren't the one who actually needed protection? If you're prepared for a tale that might linger in your thoughts long after it concludes, please hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated on our upcoming content. There was a time when I believed weddings should feel joyful. I used to picture celebration, the fragrance of blooming flowers, gentle melodies floating through the space like a soft embrace. My mother had created this vision for me during my childhood, singing while brewing chamomile tea in our small Brooklyn kitchen. However, standing there wearing a dress I never selected, under the harsh brilliance of crystal lighting on the penthouse floor of Clerk Tower, I understood something much harsher. Not every wedding celebrates love. Some are simply about staying alive. The space reeked of polished mahogany and influence, reminiscent of the executive suites I would walk past heading to my job. Locations where powerful men made choices that destroyed other people's lives. The attendees, anonymous figures dressed in charcoal and platinum, observed emotionlessly as Adrian Cleric positioned himself next to me, his expression frozen like stone. He never glanced my way. He never spoke to me, not even once. And really, why should he? To him, I was merely a contractual obligation paid in human form to settle my father's obligations. Deal finalized not through affection, but with ink on. Heartless documents 2 evenings prior, when my father had dropped to his knees before me, pleading for this sacrifice. My existence, my reputation, our family lineage. It's everything I possess, Izzy, he had murmured, gripping my hands with his trembling fingers. I had agreed because what alternative did I have? What else had I ever experienced besides sacrifice? The officiant's words resonated like whispers, echoing through stone corridors, reading promises that neither of us believed. My chest constricted when Adrian placed the ring on my hand without meeting my eyes. A simple golden circle, no gemstone, no commitment. The contracts had been executed. The ritual was merely procedural. Once finished, guests moved toward the champagne, speaking in hushed, indifferent voices. Nobody applauded. Nobody rejoiced. They had arrived to observe the conclusion of a business transaction, not the start of a union. I remained motionless until an unfamiliar woman approached me wearing a courteous smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Clerk," she murmured, her tone like velvet stretched over iron. "You wear the prison beautifully." My breathing stopped, and suddenly they had vanished, disappeared into the urban night like vapor from an extinguished flame. I can't recall how I returned to the bridal chamber. The corridors became hazy, my footsteps muffled by silence so dense I feared I might choke. There, in that enormous, dimly illuminated room scented with sandalwood and something more ominous I couldn't identify, I finally allowed the tears to come. I stood beside the glass, gazing out at New York's infinite lights, the metropolis pulsing far below as though I were invisible. I placed my hand against the cool surface. "Mom," I whispered, "tell me I made the right choice." I collapsed into the velvet chair near the dresser. My gown whispered softly as I shifted, like autumn leaves in the breeze. That's when I spotted it, something protruding from under the drawer. An aged envelope, worn around the corner, stopped my pulse. Stuttered. I grasped it with shaking hands. I knew the penmanship instantly. My mother's graceful, flowing script I hadn't witnessed in years. She had died when I was 19, well, before my father's world started crumbling. I opened the letter, my breath hitching in my throat. "If you're reading this, my precious daughter, you've accepted a life that may not feel like your own. I only hope you remember your true self when the world attempts to make you forget." I pressed the paper against my heart, the words burning deeper than I cared to acknowledge. Had she foreseen this? Had she somehow predicted this future? The loveless marriage, the oppressive quiet, The way I'd become a piece in someone else's. Strategy. Tears obscured the city lights until they resembled distant stars. I wondered, sitting there in a dress that wasn't mine, wearing a ring that held no meaning, if somewhere inside, Adrian Cleric felt as imprisoned as I did. But that was foolish, wasn't it? Men like him don't experience cages. They construct them, and I had just entered one willingly. Dawn arrived slowly in the Clark penthouse. It didn't come with birdsong or sunlight creeping through delicate curtains like it did in Brooklyn. It entered through silent floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the metropolis in silver and amber. It felt less like mourning and more like surrender. Sat by myself in the dining area that could accommodate 30 guests. One dish, one cup of cold coffee, one woman pretending she wasn't already disappearing into the background. Adrian wasn't present. Not that I had expected him to be. Following the ceremony, I hadn't encountered him again. Not even a glimpse. We hadn't conversed. We hadn't touched. We hadn't even shared the same space. I convinced myself it didn't matter. Ours wasn't that type of marriage. It wasn't really a marriage at all. It was an agreement, nothing more. But as I sat there in a silk robe, chosen by someone else, surrounded by gleaming silver and unused crystal, I experienced something unexpected. Loneliness so I rose, I walked. I searched for something, anything that felt like mine. I discovered it in the smallest kitchen at the rear of the penthouse, tucked away like a forgotten corner of a castle built for another person. It carried the faint aroma of chamomile and citrus, as though someone had once cared enough to boil water here. My hands trembled as I reached for the tea leaves, the old kettle. I hadn't prepared tea since the evening before my mother died. She had always claimed there was strength in simple rituals, quiet power in everyday things. I closed my eyes, remembering her voice. A proper cup of tea won't repair the world, Izzy, she used to whisper with a smile. But it'll give you sufficient courage to face it again come morning. So I brewed it slowly, carefully, measuring precisely the right amount, waiting for the water to sing. I cradled the mug in my palms, inhaling the warmth like it was the only genuine thing remaining in existence. I carried it back to my room and sat by the window overlooking Manhattan. I didn't meet this time. I simply sipped the tea, allowing the silence to fill the empty spaces within me. That's when I heard them. 2 voices, quiet and careful, drifting down the corridor outside my door. I froze, holding my breath. He hasn't told her. It was a woman's voice, gentle but sharp. No, came the response. James, Adrian's personal assistant. I recognized the crisp British accent in his words. He settled the hospital bills, she whispered. Paid for her father's treatment too, discreetly. But if she ever discovers this, you know what she assumed. Let her, James replied softly. Some obligations are better fulfilled in silence. I pressed my hand over my heart, feeling it skip in my chest. Adrian had paid not just the business debt, but the medical bills, my father's treatments. He had done all of it, quietly. But why? I stared down at the wedding ring on my finger, the same ring I had wanted to tear off since the moment he'd placed it there without looking at me. I thought of the letter from my mother still hidden in my drawer like a secret I wasn't prepared to confront. You've accepted a life that might not feel like your own, she had written. But what if it wasn't? Just my life that felt foreign? What if Adrian had constructed his entire existence on decisions that had never truly belonged to him either? I set the tea down carefully, my fingers shaking. For the first time since I had agreed to this arrangement, I realized something that terrified me far more than being unwanted. I might have been completely wrong about Adrian O'Cleric. I didn't seek him out after that. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. I wanted to march down those endless glass hallways, stand before him and demand to know why. Why he'd paid. Why he'd remained silent. Why he'd married me like a stranger but held my family's future in his hands. Like it mattered, but I didn't because I wasn't ready to hear whatever lie he'd offer to push me further away. Because part of me needed it to mean something more, so I let the days pass in quiet routine. I brewed tea each morning in the hidden kitchen. I sat by the window each evening, watching lights flicker on across the city like tiny defiant stars refusing to die. And every night I thought about the letter, about the words my mother had left behind. You've accepted a life that might not feel like your own. I wondered if she had ever felt the same. Trapped, small, afraid. A week after the wedding, I left the tower for the first time. I didn't inform Adrian. I wasn't sure he would have noticed if I had. The driver waited at the curb, eyes lowered, as I climbed into the black car that smelled faintly of leather and rain. We drove in silence all the way to Brooklyn. The house appeared smaller than I remembered. The paint had peeled along the window frames, and the garden my mother once cherished had grown wild and untamed. But the door was still red, the same stubborn shade my mother had chosen 30 years ago, when she'd promised herself she'd make this house a home. I stood there for a long moment before knocking. The woman who opened the door looked older than the mother I had kissed goodbye 5 years ago. Her skin was pale, her cheeks sunken, but her eyes still held that same steady light that had carried me through every dark season of my life. Isabel, she breathed, her voice breaking on my name. I stepped inside before the tears could fall. She was lying on the old sofa, a worn blanket draped over her knees. The air smelled of mint tea and lavender oil, her favorite comforting scents. I knelt beside her, taking her frail hands in mine. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "I had to," I said softly. "I needed to see you." Her eyes drifted to the gold band on my finger. "You did it, didn't you?" I nodded. "It's done." She let out a breath I hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You saved your father." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "He doesn't deserve it." She didn't argue. She never did when it came to him. But then she said something I wasn't expecting. Something that cracked open the careful shell I'd built around my heart. "Adrian isn't your enemy, is he?" I pulled back slightly, frowning. "You don't know him, Mom?" "I know more than you think." She reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering whatever strength she had left. "Years ago," she whispered, "before you were born, your father and I were friends with Adrian's parents. Best friends. We built everything together. Dreams, businesses, families. But your father, he ruined it all." I felt the breath leave my lungs. "What are you talking about?" She opened her eyes again, tears shimmering like fragile glass. "He betrayed Adrian's father, stole from him, lied, left their family drowning in lawsuits while ours survived." I shook my head. No, that's not possible." "Adrian, he's the one who could have destroyed us," she said quietly. "But he didn't. He never did. Not even when he had every right." I sank back on my heels, the room spinning around me. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was ashamed," she whispered. "Because I didn't want you to grow up hating your father, hating the man I once loved. And because part of me hoped you'd never have to pay for his mistakes." My hands trembled in my lap. All this time, all this hatred I'd carried, it had been built on lies I'd never seen. That night, I couldn't bring myself to leave her. I stayed until she fell asleep, her breathing soft and steady beneath the thin blanket. I pressed a kiss to her forehead before slipping out into the cool night air. The car was waiting at the curb. I climbed in without a word, my heart pounding louder than the engine. I didn't tell the driver to take me back to the suite. I didn't tell him to take me anywhere. I just sat there staring out the window as the city passed by in blurred streaks of light and shadow, wondering how long Adrienne had carried the weight of a debt that wasn't his to repay. I thought of the tea, the letter, his silence. And when the car finally turned the corner onto Elclerc Tower's private drive, I did something I hadn't planned. I asked the driver to stop. I stepped out into the night alone and walked not toward the elevators, but toward the east side of the building, toward the glass-walled library I'd passed by a dozen times before without daring to enter. The lights were dim, but I could see him. Adrienne, sitting alone in a leather armchair, a glass of something dark in his hand, staring at a framed photograph resting on the table beside him. I moved closer, my breath catching when I saw it. It was a picture of my mother and his mother, both young, both laughing, both standing in front of the red door of my childhood home. I pressed my palm to the glass wall, something breaking open inside me. Adrian Elcleric was not the man I thought he was. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the woman I had been pretending to be either. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the guest bed in the far corner of the penthouse, staring at the small silver frame I'd placed on my nightstand. The picture of my mother I'd brought back from Brooklyn. She'd been so full of light in that photograph, smiling as if the world had never once asked her to break for it. How strange it felt now to know. She had once laughed beside Adrian's mother. How strange to think the man I had vowed to hate had carried that memory with him all this time. I could have ignored it. Could have let pride keep the distance between us like it always had. But there was something about the way he'd sat there alone. Something about the way his shoulders had slumped when no one was watching. Maybe I should have felt vindicated. Maybe I should have held on to my anger a little longer. But all I could feel was the ache of something unfinished. Morning came again, soft and gray, pressing its quiet breath against the glass windows. I rose before the house stirred, padded barefoot to that little kitchen in the back. The kettle hissed softly as I set the mug on a tray, placing it next to a small plate of the buttered toast I knew he never ate, but always left untouched in the dining room. It wasn't much, but it was something. I carried the tray to his office door, pausing to gather the courage that felt more fragile than I wanted to admit. My knuckles hovered over the wood for a full minute before I finally knocked, just once. Softly. Silence. I almost turned away, almost convinced myself this was foolish. But then I heard his voice, low, tired. Come in. He was standing by the window, his back to me, one hand pressed to the glass as if he could push through it to reach something just beyond his grasp. I cleared my throat quietly. I brought you something. He didn't turn right away, didn't speak. I set the tray down on the small table by the window and waited. The air felt thick between us, heavy with things unsaid. Finally, he spoke, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. You shouldn't have to do that. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of how small I felt in his world. Neither should you, I whispered, his head bowed slightly, as if the weight of those words pressed harder than anything he'd carried before. He turned then, slowly, his face shadowed by something I couldn't name. I don't know how to fix this, he said quietly. I looked down at my hands. Maybe you don't have to. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? I lifted my gaze to meet his, forcing myself to hold it this time. Maybe we just start small, one thing at a time. He didn't move for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. He reached for the tea, wrapping his hand around the mug I had brought for him. His fingers brushed mine. It was the first time we had touched since our wedding day, and God help me, I didn't pull away. We stood there in the quiet hum of the city waking below. Two people with nothing to say and everything to learn. After a while, I spoke again, softer. This time, why did you do it? He didn't ask what I meant. He knew. He exhaled slowly, setting the mug down before leaning his palms on the windowsill, his reflection folding into the skyline. I thought if I paid the debt, maybe it would be enough to keep you away from all this, he murmured. From me. I swallowed hard. Why? Because I didn't want you to hate me more than you already did. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped closer, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch the back of his hand. I never hated you, Adrian, I whispered. I just didn't understand you. His jaw tensed like he was fighting the urge to believe me. I bit my lip, feeling the edges of something fragile begin to shift inside me. I saw the picture, I added quietly, of our mothers together. His posture stiffened, but he didn't pull away. He just stood there, letting the truth hang between us like a fragile thread waiting to snap. I used to think it was all your fault, I continued, my voice shaking, but it wasn't. I know that now. And I'm sorry I never asked for the whole story sooner. He turned toward me then slowly, as if he were afraid any sudden movement might break the moment. You don't have to be sorry, he said softly. I deserved your anger. I shook my head, fighting the sting of tears. No, you didn't. You deserve better. His expression cracked just a little. And before I could lose my nerve, I took one more step forward and did the only thing I could think to do. I wrapped my arms around him, not like a prisoner reaching for freedom, but like someone finally letting go of the weight they'd carried too long. He stood frozen for a heartbeat, and then slowly, carefully, he pulled me closer. His arms circled my back, holding me as if he'd been waiting for this moment far longer than either of us had dared to admit. We didn't speak after that. We just stood there wrapped in the kind of silence that didn't feel empty anymore. The kind of silence that felt full. And for the first time since I'd walked into that cold, glittering tower, I didn't feel quite so alone. That's strange, the things you miss when life feels too heavy to carry. The sound of wind brushing through leaves, the smell of earth after rain, the warmth of sunlight on your face when you're not thinking about how to survive the next moment. I hadn't realized how much I missed those small, ordinary things until I found him in the garden. It was a Wednesday, cloudy but not cold. A kind of morning that begged you to step outside just long enough to remember you had a heart still beating in your chest. I had spent the past few days avoiding the question that circled my mind like a restless bird. What happens next? After that morning in his office, after the tea, the apology, the quiet way he held me like I was the first real thing he'd touched in years, I'd found myself standing in the hallway outside his door more than once, wanting to knock, not daring. Too, we'd shared something. I knew that. But the space between us still felt fragile, as if one wrong word might send us spiraling back into silence. So I waited and watched and wondered if maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for me to. It was James who mentioned it in passing as he checked on me in the library that morning. He's in the conservatory, he said quietly, as if it wasn't strange at all. The conservatory? I hadn't even known there was one. When James left, I wandered down the hallway I'd never dared to explore. It felt warmer here, less polished. The marble floors gave way to smooth wood. The air smelled faintly of cedar, and something sweeter I couldn't quite place. I paused outside a set of glass doors, and there he was. Adrian Al-Cleric, the man I had married without knowing the shape of his heart, was kneeling in the dirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, planting something small and delicate in a pot of dark soil. Lavender. The sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, wrapping him in a soft glow that made him look different. Not cold, not distant. Just a man tending to something fragile. I stood there, afraid to break whatever quiet spell hung in the air. But then he spoke without turning around. I never thought you'd come down here. His voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't guarded. It was almost warm. I stepped closer, brushing my fingers along the leaves of a nearby fern. I didn't know this place existed. He glanced over his shoulder, one corner of his mouth curving ever so slightly. Most people don't. I watched him press the soil, gently as if the plant might shatter beneath his touch. My mother used to spend hours here, he said quietly. She said lavender reminded her that fragile things are still worth keeping. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. She was right. He looked up at me, then really looked. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself for what I might find in his eyes. You remind me of her, he murmured, my breath caught. Because I'm fragile? No, he said softly. Because you're still standing. I knelt beside him without thinking, brushing dirt from my hands onto the thighs of my dress, like I used to when I worked in my mother's garden back home. I used to help my mom plant herbs in our little backyard, I whispered. She said the same thing, that small things could survive if you cared enough to tend them. His fingers stilled in the soil. She was friends with your mother, wasn't she? I asked, needing to hear him say it. He nodded. They were more than friends. They were family in all the ways that mattered. I bit my lip, feeling the ache build in my chest. I didn't know. She never told me. He leaned back on his heels, wiping his hands on a cloth. I think she wanted to protect you from the weight of what happened between our families. I pressed, my palms into the floor, grounding myself in the quiet truth of it all. And you, I whispered, why did you never tell me? His jaw tensed, his gaze dropping to the lavender between us. Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. Not love, not forgiveness, not even understanding. I reached for the small plant, letting my fingers trail softly over the petals. Maybe I don't, I said quietly. But maybe I want to give them anyway. He stilled. And in that fragile, open moment, I dared to ask the question that had been haunting me since the night I first stood in this tower. Adrian, did you ever want this marriage? Or was it always just payment? He didn't answer right away. He stood, brushing the dirt from his knees, his back to me once again. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he curled his fists. Like he was holding something back, and then softly, so softly, I almost missed it, he whispered, I wanted you, Isabel. He turned, meeting my gaze with an honesty that shook me to my core. I just didn't know how to deserve you. I rose to my feet, my breath catching in my throat. He took a step closer, then stopped as if waiting for me to close the space between us dots, so I did. I reached for his hand, dirty and rough, not the polished mask he wore for the world. I laced my fingers with his, grounding both of us in something real, something tender, something quietly brave. You don't have to deserve me, I whispered. You just have to let me in. His eyes shimmered with something that looked a lot like hope. And for the first time since we'd said our vows, I believed there might be something worth saving here after all. I used to believe that truth arrived like thunder loud, jarring, impossible to ignore. But standing in Adrian's private study, that evening, I learned that truth sometimes arrives quietly, like the turning of a page. The sun had set early, casting long shadows across the glass walls of the tower. We hadn't spoken much since that morning in the conservatory, but the air between us had shifted. It felt less like a battlefield and more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. I found him there after dinner, alone again. He didn't hear me at first. He was seated on the floor, his back resting against the base of a bookshelf, an old leather-bound album open across his lap. The overhead lights were off, leaving only the dim glow of a single desk lamp to illuminate the space around him. I hovered in the doorway, torn between leaving him to his quiet and stepping into the fragile peace we'd only just begun to build. I chose the second. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could see the way his fingers trembled slightly as he turned the next page. The air smelled faintly of leather and dust, like the attic I used to hide in as a child when the world felt too loud. "What are you looking at?" I asked softly. He flinched just barely, but didn't close the album. "Memories," he replied, his voice raw. "Ones I used to think I wanted to forget." I lowered myself to the floor beside him, leaving just enough space that he wouldn't feel cornered. "May I see?" He hesitated, then slowly turned the album so I could. Look, the first picture was one I'd never seen before. Two women standing arm in arm in front of the red door of my childhood home. My mother and his, both laughing like the whole world hadn't broken them yet. Tears pricked my eyes before I could stop them. "They look happy," I whispered. "They were," he said quietly, "until your father ruined everything." I flinched, the familiar sting of shame tightening in my chest. "I know," I whispered. "My mother told me the truth about what he did." He nodded, his jaw tight. "He cost my family everything." I watched my father fall apart piece by piece. I watched my mother lose every friend she had left, except yours. I glanced at him, the weight of his words sinking deep. "I didn't know," I whispered. "I never wanted you to," he replied, turning another page. "I thought if I kept you at arm's length, maybe you'd never have to carry that guilt. Maybe you could walk away clean." I swallowed hard, staring at the images of two families I never knew had once been so closely bound. We were never clean. Adrian, none of us. His hand still on the page. "I didn't want you to hate me for what your father did, and I didn't want you to hate me for who I was forced to become," I whispered. We sat there, the silence wrapping around us like a fragile cocoon. After a long pause, he spoke again, softer this time. "I didn't marry you for revenge, Isabel. I married you because for a long time I've carried something I didn't know how to name." I turned to face him fully, my breath catching in my throat. "And what's that?" He closed the album gently, his eyes lifting to meet mine. "Hope," he whispered. Didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to hold the weight of that single word without breaking under it. So I reached for his hand again, not because I had the right words, but because sometimes touch spoke louder than anything else. He let out a slow breath like he'd been holding it for years. "I was wrong to keep you in the dark," he whispered. "I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was only protecting myself." I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling him tense, then relax. "I think we've both been hiding behind walls that aren't helping anyone," I whispered. He nodded, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to tear them down." "Maybe we don't have to," I replied softly. "Maybe we just open a door instead." He pulled me closer then, so carefully I could barely feel the movement. And there, on the floor of his study, surrounded by the remnants of a past neither of us had chosen, Adrian L. Cleric whispered the first real confession I'd ever heard from him. "I want to build something new with you, Isabel. Something that isn't born out of debt or duty or guilt." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "Something real," I whispered. "Something real." He promised Dot, and for the first time since the day I'd slipped that meaningless gold band onto my finger, I believed him. Some moments you carry with you for the rest of your life. Not because they were loud or grand or picture perfect, but because they shifted something so deeply inside you that you knew somehow nothing would ever be the same. Dot, finding that letter was one of those moments. I spent the next few days wrapped in something fragile but steady, almost like peace. Adrienne and I still moved carefully around each other, but the silence between us no longer felt cold. It felt patient, like two people learning to speak a language they had forgotten but once knew by heart. Sometimes we crossed paths in the Hallways and our eyes would linger a little longer than before. Sometimes I'd find him watching me from the doorway as I read by the window, a soft warmth flickering in his expression like candlelight. We didn't rush it. And for the first time, I didn't want to dot. It was a Sunday morning when I returned to Brooklyn. Alone. Adrienne had offered to come with me, but I needed this visit to be mine. My mother had grown weaker. The doctors had done what they could, but her body was slowly letting go. I sat with her for hours in that tiny living room that smelled of lavender oil and old books. I held her hand, listened to her breath as it rattled softly in her chest. She didn't have many words left, but she smiled when she saw me. And that was enough. Spent that afternoon sorting through the drawers in her bedroom, looking for something to bring back to the tower. A small piece of her to hold on to. That's when I found it, tucked between the pages of an old recipe book, sealed in an envelope. With my name written in her delicate, familiar handwriting, my heart skipped. I sat on the edge of her bed and slowly opened the envelope, unfolding the letter with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. My dearest Izzy, if you are reading this, then I have already said all the words my lips could carry. But there is one more truth I must place in your heart before I go. I made many mistakes, but none greater than letting you believe you were alone in this world. You're not. You never have been. Adrian, he is not the man I once feared he might become. He is more. He has carried burdens that were never his to bear, all because he loved you long before either of you knew how to name it. If you can let him in, not because you owe him, but because I believe he is the only man who will ever love you the way you deserve to be loved. And if you cannot, if your heart is too bruised to try, know that I understand, and I'm proud of you still. You have always been my greatest joy. With all my love, Mom. Tears blurred the page, slipping onto my trembling hands. I clutched the letter to my chest, rocking slightly as a sob broke free from the place I had locked it away for too long. She knew. She had known all along. And somehow, even at the end, she still believed in us, me and Adrienne, when I wasn't sure I could. I stayed with her until sunset, whispering stories of my childhood, of her garden, of the lavender that still bloomed in Adrienne's conservatory. She drifted in and out of sleep, her breaths growing softer, slower, and then, sometime just after dusk, she let go. Quietly, gently, the way she had lived her life. I pressed my lips to her forehead, thanking her for every sacrifice she had ever made, for every truth she had carried in silence to protect me. And when I finally stood, I knew there was only one place I needed to be. Adrienne was waiting by the window when I returned to the tower. He didn't say anything as I entered the room. He didn't ask. He just opened his arms. I went to him without hesitation. He held me the way no one else ever had, not as a promise, not as a duty, but as something real, something true. I buried my face in his chest, letting the weight of the day fall into the quiet space between us. She's gone, I whispered, my voice breaking. He rested his chin,